On July 13th, 1793, blood mixed with bathwater in a small Paris apartment. A young woman had just plunged a knife into the chest of Jean-Paul Marat, one of the most feared and controversial figures of the French Revolution. She didn't run. She sat calmly, unshaken, convinced that this single act of violence would save France from itself. This is the story of Charlotte Corday, the angel of assassination, who killed a revolutionary and paid the ultimate price. In 1793, France was drowning in blood. The revolution's promise, liberty, equality, fraternity, had curdled into paranoia and non-stop executions. The guillotine's blade fell every day. At the center of much of the turmoil was Jean-Paul Marat, a doctor-turned-radical journalist whose newspaper, L'Ami du Peuple, the friend of the people, named supposed enemies of the revolution and frequently incited outrage. His words functioned as public denunciations that stirred Parisian mobs and helped spark violent episodes like the September massacres of 1792, when crowds slaughtered more than 1,000 prisoners. Far from the feverish streets of Paris, in the quieter province of Normandy, a young woman named Charlotte Corday read those papers with mounting horror. Born into minor, impoverished nobility and descended from the playwright Pierre Corneille, Corday wasn't a stereotypical aristocrat. Educated in a convent and an avid reader, she devoured Enlightenment thinkers like Rousseau and Voltaire. She called herself a Republican, a believer in the Revolution's original ideals. But she sympathized with the Girondins, a moderate faction that wanted a constitutional republic and was appalled at the growing bloodshed. To Corday, Marat and his radical Jacobin allies were not saving the republic, they were corrupting it. The Girondins pushed for restraint and constitutional order, but in revolutionary Paris moderation came to look like weakness or even treason. The Jacobins, with Marat's furious voice leading the charge, saw enemies everywhere and believed the revolution could only survive by purging anyone not radical enough. That clash, Girondins versus Jacobins, became a fight for France's soul. For Charlotte Corday, the conflict was deeply personal and moral. She watched her country slide towards civil war, and she saw Marat as one of the chief architects of that descent. His newspaper wasn't just ink and paper to her. It was the engine of a growing reign of terror. In her mind, his death was the only cure. She believed that silencing Marat might stop the violence, prevent civil war, and restore the revolution to its noble path. As she later declared at her trial, "I have killed one man to save a 100,000. Corday's plan formed in the agonizing summer of 1793 after the Jacobins seized total control and expelled Girondin leaders from the National Convention. Many Girondins fled Paris for the provinces. Some ended up where Corday lived. She sought them out, listened to their speeches, and admired their principles. Their arguments only hardened her conviction that they were the true preservers of France. She became obsessed with the idea that Marat was the source of the nation's sickness, and decided that removing him would be a decisive act. She initially imagined a dramatic public act, killing Marat in front of the entire convention so the nation could not ignore the message. She wrote an address to the French people, a manifesto explaining her motives, denouncing Marat as a monster and declaring her readiness to die for her country. Armed with a copy of Plutarch's Parallel Lives and burning with purpose, the 24-year-old set off for Paris. But her plan quickly encountered a problem. Marat no longer frequented the convention. Confined largely to his home at 30 Rue de Cordeliers, he suffered from a painful skin condition that forced him to spend much of his time in a medicinal bath. The public stage she had imagined became a bathtub. Corday adapted. On the morning of July 13th, 1793, she went to the Palais, bought a kitchen knife with a 6-inch blade, and hid it beneath her dress. She tried to gain entry to Marat's apartment under a false pretense, but her first attempt failed. She was turned away by Simon Everard, Marat's partner. Undeterred, Corday wrote a note claiming she possessed sensitive information about fugitives, enough to persuade someone to grant her access. Her determination and careful preparation would get her another chance. What followed is the now famous and chilling sequence. She was admitted, entered the small room where Marat soaked and worked and stabbed him in the chest. He died. She made no attempt to flee. She waited calmly, certain that she had acted for the good of France. Corday's assassination of Marat became an instant sensation, a single, violent stroke intended to cut the revolution back to its founding principles. Her trial and execution were swift. The revolutionary courts and the public treated the killing as both political theater and an act laden with symbolism. For some, Corday was a murderer. For others, a martyr. She insisted that her act had been a sacrifice to save the nation. Her famous line at trial, "I have killed one man to save a 100,000, crystallized the conviction behind her deed. The grim calculus of one life against many, and the belief that a single decisive act could change the course of history. Charlotte Corday paid the price. The revolution she loved was already a whirlwind of violence and suspicion, and neither mercy nor subtlety spared her. But her story endures as one of the era's most haunting contradictions. A woman steeped in Enlightenment thought who turned to assassination, convinced that murder could restore virtue to a republic gone mad. In the blood-splashed apartment on July 13th, 1793, that contradiction was writ plain, and the ripples of her act would be felt through the violent, uncertain years that followed. Gironda, who had escaped to her home city of Caen. It was a brilliant and cruel piece of bait. Charlotte Corday knew Marat's obsession with hunting down his enemies, and she was sure he wouldn't be able to resist the lure. That evening, she returned to his apartment. The concierge tried to stop her again, but as they argued, Marat, who had received her note, overheard the commotion from his bath. He called out, ordering that she be allowed to enter. The door opened, and Charlotte Corday was led into the small, steamy room where the friend of the people sat half-submerged in his medicated bathwater. A vinegar-soaked turban wrapped around his head, and a wooden board stretched across the tub, serving as his desk. The scene was strangely ordinary. Marat, the feared demagogue whose words had unleashed mobs, appeared simply as a frail man, weakened by illness, working from his bath. He invited Corday to sit and asked for the names of the traitors in Caen. Calmly, she began listing them one by one. Marat wrote each down diligently, supposedly declaring with satisfaction that they would all soon be guillotined. That was the moment. For Corday, his words were the final confirmation she needed, proof that he was a monster who would never stop killing. She stood. In one fluid motion, she drew the knife from her bodice and plunged it deep into his chest, just below the collarbone. The blade sliced through his lung, aorta, and heart. Marat cried out in shock and agony. Aidez-moi, ma chère Amy. Help me, my dear friend. And then he was gone. Simone Everard, Marat's companion, rushed into the room to find Corday standing calmly by the tub. Chaos erupted. A distributor from Marat's newspaper who happened to be there grabbed Corday, while neighbors ran in, trying desperately to revive Marat. But it was too late. The man whose writings had condemned thousands was dead, murdered in his own home in a single, intimate act of violence. Corday didn't resist. Her mission was complete. She was arrested immediately. Her trial began just 4 days later, a public spectacle from the start. The verdict was never in question. She openly admitted what she had done. The prosecution's main goal was to prove she was part of a larger Girondan conspiracy. They simply couldn't believe that a young woman could conceive and carry out such an act alone. When the infamous prosecutor Antoine Fouquier-Tinville suggested she must have practiced the fatal blow beforehand, Corday recoiled and snapped back. The monster! He takes me for an assassin. Throughout all, she remained poised, calm, and resolute. She insisted she had acted alone, guided only by her conscience. When asked what she hoped to achieve, she said simply that with Marat dead, perhaps the others will tremble. Her defense attorney, Claude-François Chevalier, faced an impossible task. Corday's own words were a full confession. Her most famous line from the trial summed up her belief. I have killed one man to save 100,000. Her calm defiance fascinated Paris. During the trial, a young National Guard officer named Jean-Jacques Hauer began sketching her. Corday, intrigued, asked if he could paint her full portrait before the execution. The request was granted. For 2 hours, she sat in her cell as he worked, creating the haunting image that would define her legacy. When the executioner, Charles-Henri Sanson, arrived, she calmly snipped a lock of her hair and gave it to the painter as thanks. On July 17, 1793, Charlotte Corday was taken to the guillotine. She wore the red smock reserved for parricides, those who killed fathers of the people. She was paraded through the streets of Paris in an open cart. A sudden summer storm broke out, drenching her. Witnesses said the rain made her look almost saint-like, an ethereal figure on her final journey. Her execution became nearly as famous as her crime. After the blade fell, one of the executioner's assistants lifted her severed head and slapped it across the cheek. According to witnesses, her face blushed as if in outrage. A strange and eerie moment that for centuries fueled debate about whether consciousness lingers briefly after decapitation. But Corday's act did not bring peace. In fact, it did the opposite. The Jacobins turned Marat into a revolutionary martyr. His funeral was a massive, state-orchestrated spectacle. His likeness began to replace religious icons in homes and public spaces. Instead of ending the reign of terror, the assassination fanned the flames, giving the radicals an excuse for even more purges and executions. Charlotte Corday's legacy remains as complicated as the revolution she tried to save. To the Jacobins, she was a monster. To others, especially later writers who called her Lang de l'Assassinat, the angel of assassination, she was a hero. She failed in her mission to restore peace, but she succeeded in becoming an immortal symbol, proof that one person, driven by conviction and a desperate desire for justice, can commit a terrible act in the name of a greater good. Charlotte Corday endures as one of history's most haunting figures, a woman who believed that killing a man could save a nation. Her story continues to challenge our understanding of heroism, terrorism, and the bloody cost of revolution.